Chapter 19. Jim looked at Akira. "If I get reincarnated after this, you are going to owe me big time." "Agreed," said Akira. Jim glanced at the troop of monks who had stopped their drumming and were sat awaiting instructions. The chief abbot was looking down at them from the stage. He looked worried. That anxious gaze gave Jim a sudden rush of pleasure. It wasn't a look of concern for them. It was a look of concern for himself. Whatever was down there was worth a lot more than boxes of gold, gems, and ancient manuscripts. But it was obtainable. The fact that the monks didn't want them to find it was enough to want to make an attempt. "Let's go wake up Buddha," he said. "Let's hope he doesn't mind." The chief abbot trotted down the stage stairs and sprang towards them. "Wait," he said in Japanese. He began exhorting them, gesturing at the treasures, ingratiatingly imploring them. "What did he say?" Jim asked Akira. Akira grunted and scowled. "Ha! He said nothing." "That's what I thought," said Jim. "Sayonara," said Yoshi to the chief abbot with a long bow. The abbot put his hand on Yoshi's shoulder. "We don't want to lose you. I have already left." Lowering Akira down was easy. He was small and light, and Yoshi helped a lot. Lowering Yoshi down was another matter. If Yoshi knew what he was doing when it came to climbing, it would have been an easy task, but he didn't. So at times Jim had to take a large part of the young monk's weight as he lowered him. Now it was his turn. He adjusted the harness and put it on and made a simple rappelling hitch through the carabiner. He tied the rope onto the key and tested the hitch. It had been a long, strange road that led him here. How did he even know how to do this? The answer had been through fear. It wasn't a plan for this moment that had brought him the knowledge and strength for this ordeal, but a crazed path of money and danger that told him he must be prepared for anything. Even he thought himself paranoid in his training. He had been thrown to the fates before, like a kitten to savage mastiffs, and those experiences had marked him and sent him on a strange course of constant preparation. "This is my fault," he thought as he leaned back into the void. "I didn't have to come here. I could have walked away 3-4 times already. To hell with Akira. I don't have to follow him. I could be walking out in the sunlight right now and be heading for the train." He felt his feet on the wall. "I've got all the money on earth, and I could be spending it on drugs, women, and toys. I could swim in a lake of champagne." He jerked downwards. "I could have my own harem of the world's most beautiful women. I could buy my own luxury hotel, and in every room there could be another fabulous girl, even 2 or 3. The rope was skidding on the carabiner as he let himself down. "I could buy my own moon mission and pay for someone else's trip to Mars." He was walking down the wall. "I could build hospitals, fund cures for disease, influence countries. Instead, I'm shimmying down a well full of corpses, trying to find and wake up a dead person." Akira's head appeared alongside his. "This is mad," said Jim. Akira smiled. "I know, but we made it. Better get out of my way before this rope snaps." Akira stepped back and Jim landed. Jim unclipped the carabiner and untangled the line from its slipknot. "Let me get out of my hot things," he said, struggling out of the harness in the confined space. Above, the chief abbot and the assistant abbot crouched down by the pitfall. They stared in, and then at the rope, and then the hitch. At midnight they would reset the rooms and the floor would close. They would have to untie the rope before then. "Come," said the chief abbot. "We must hurry." Chapter 20. The assistant abbot halted at the metal door. "The day has come," said the chief abbot, "for you to know the final secrets." The assistant abbot bowed. "Domo, domo." "There are 3 secrets." The assistant abbot bowed. "But sadly I only know part of 2 of them. Beyond this door is the next secret." He unlocked the door and switched on the lights, which barely illuminated the long corridor-like space. There were contrivances set into the right wall. "Crossbows?" exclaimed the assistant abbot rhetorically. "We must load them." "But these are new," I had them replaced myself 10 years ago. Now we must hurry and load them." The assistant abbot's mouth was agape. "Quickly now, watch me." There were 3 set closely together at the end of the corridor. Yoshi looked back into the passage. "It's a big empty room." "Sure," said Jim. "That will be safe then." "Let me through," said Akira. He shone his torch about. "There," he said. "All down the side are—" His voice stopped mid-word. "Oh, there are bones there."
"Great. Bodies all along the wall?"
"No arrows, and yes, a body, but in the middle of the room, or so it looks to me."
Jim was dying to see what Akira was talking about, and he pushed past Yoshi and jammed himself behind Akira to see into the room.
"Arrows fly from the wall over here and hit the other wall."
Jim could see faint outlines in the grain of the floor.
"See that pile over there? Those are likely the remains of someone struck by an arrow."
"Arrows at waist height," said Yoshi. "We crawl over the floor." "Nice idea," said Jim. "YIYP."
"YIYP?"
said Akira. "Your idea, your problem, no?" said Yoshi.
"You mean I try it out? It is okay by me."
"Wait," said Jim. "It's not that simple. I know what happens next. The moment you step out of this doorway, this passage is going to close." Akira was scanning the room with the beam of his searchlight. He said,
"I have a better idea."
He pointed his light at the far end of the long room.
"See, there is the passage."
"We could go along the back wall," suggested Jim, signaling the wall past the tunnel. "Then go down to the wall where the arrows get fired from. Then step over or under where they fly out."
"Just follow me, step for step,"
said Akira, stepping out of the passageway. There was a booming noise, and the roof above them moved. Akira jumped to one side, and Jim and Yoshi tumbled out on the sunken flagstone Akira had just stepped on.
"Maybe I'm wrong, but I think not,"
said Akira. There was a crash, and the doorway was sealed.
"I'm sorry,"
said Akira.
"I'm very sorry, but follow me exactly."
He shone the torch on the roof.
"Read."
Jim could faintly see there were characters carved into the roof. It looked as if it had perhaps been painted eons ago. "I can't read Japanese," said Jim.
"What does it say?"
asked Yoshi. "What characters are they?"
"Very old, very rare," said Akira. "The path of the faithful is narrow. Evil surrounds on all sides. Only the true can find the perfect path. The lost and the weak will perish."
"Is that a haiku?" asked Jim.
"No,"
said Akira. Chapter 21. The assistant abbot was mesmerized by the crossbows. He had heard the boom of the slamming passage, and soon arrows would be fired through their long stone barrels at the searchers. Impaled, they would die. Perhaps just one of them. What would the others do? Would they go on? Would they take their wounded or dead friend with them? Would any of them make it through? What was on the other side?
3 arrows,
3 people, he said.
Yes.
No arrows, no people, he said.
2 arrows, and then what?
There was no way back, and 2 mysteries ahead. 1 arrow? No one has ever succeeded. Are you sure?
No.
Do we know the purpose of all this?
Yes.
Then tell it to me.
I cannot.
It can only be shown. Show me.
I cannot show you. It is inside of you. Only you can see it.
The assistant abbot thought, and in his 2 seconds of pause, his mind raced. 3 people, 2 of which had gotten through the enlightenments like the wind through tall grass, and seemed capable of succeeding and passing through the rest of the maze. To help them, there were only 10 crossbows for 3 people, and the shots would hardly be particularly accurate. Surely one person would get through. All 3 might survive, and then what? What would they tell the world? That the temple monks had tried to kill them with crossbows in a dungeon? But just one survival would be yet more catastrophic. That would land 2 murders in their lap. Anyone who might live to tell their story would destroy the temple if they revealed the monks had killed innocent adventurers with steel-tipped crossbow bolts, wickedly tipped to lacerate. Would he be called upon to kill any survivors to save the temple from infamy and closure? "We must do no evil," he said, snatching the bolt from the first crossbow. He nodded his determination at the chief abbot, his face muscles racked with defiance. He ran down the line of crossbows, disarming them. He charged back to the abbot and threw the arrows at his feet. The abbot crouched down and pushed the crossbow bolts about. "The Chinese would take these as a good omen." He stood up, a bolt held in his hand like a dagger. "You choose to set a new course for our karma." "Yes." "And Yoshi too." "I cannot speak for him." "I do not ask you to." The chief abbot looked to set the bolt back on the first bow. He hesitated. "It is a new era." He looked at the bolt and let it drop to the ground. "Perhaps the Chinese are right." The first crossbow triggered, and then the second, then the third and the fourth. The abbots looked at each other. Chapter 22. "You were right, Akira," said Jim, patting the professor on the back. "Thank you," said Akira. Only nothing," said Akira. Chapter 23. The passage led upward, then turned into a short, steep staircase. At the top was an iron grate, leading into a sunlit room ahead. "Don't open the door," said Jim. "We don't want to get thrown out of this tunnel or crushed." Yoshi forced his face into the central gap in the grate and took in the scene. "I always wondered about those windows," he said. "I imagined they lit a room for the senior monks. Now I know." Jim was trying to look past Yoshi. "What's in there?" "A big space, but not big enough." "Big enough for what?" said Jim. "The shrine is much bigger on the outside than on the inside. There is a huge area you cannot enter, and this is part of it." "Let me have a look." Yoshi moved back from the door, and Jim squeezed past. "It's another swimming pool kind of thing." Jim twisted his head and tried to make out the far wall. "Looks like tunnels, like the last pool." "Is that water?" "That's water." "It doesn't look deep," said Yoshi. "You can tell from here," said Jim. "Very clever," said Akira from behind them. "Crocodiles." "Crocodiles," said Jim. "There was a moat with crocodiles, sacred beasts from China." "Oh," Yoshi said. "People fed the sacred crocodiles with chickens." "There are crocodiles at the shrine?" "So this room would have crocodiles in, ones that came in from the outside. They would protect this room," said Akira. "There are crocs in there?" said Jim, scanning the dimly lit room. "No," said Akira. "Crocodiles were all eaten in the Second World War. There were no chickens to feed them, and crocodile tastes good, especially to hungry people. The moat was filled in the 1960s. Jim turned back to Akira. "Are we sure about that?" "That is the history of the shrine. I cannot imagine a crocodile living 70 years without food, can you?" said Akira. Jim looked into the room. It made sense to him. The pool had sloping sides, so the crocodiles could run up from the water. He looked across to the exit. Somehow you would need to run a lethal gauntlet of hungry crocodiles to get to the other side. That would be a tall task. "Are you sure they've all gone? Yoshi, have you ever seen crocodiles at your temple?" "None, never. I didn't even know they existed here." "Okay," said Jim. "Let's go." He looked around. "How do we open this door?" "Hole in the wall," suggested Akira. Jim checked his coat for the long-nosed screwdriver. It didn't seem to be there. "Here," said Akira, offering him the ancient key. "I've been saving this priceless artifact. Do not damage it." Jim took it and pushed it into the hole in the wall. There was a clank and the door opened. "Let's step out fast in case something falls on our heads," said Jim. 3, 2, 1, go! They sprang out, but nothing happened. They turned and looked at the door. Jim shrugged, then leapt backwards with a shout of surprise. There was a clang and the door slammed shut.
"Booby trap, stiff with age,"
said Akira. "Don't move," said Jim. "Let's look around first. Check the walls and roof. Let's make sure it's not just the crocodiles that are meant to catch us out." He looked at the dark waters in the pool that swamped the middle of the room. "That's not good," he said. "Something's moving in there." "What is it?" said Yoshi. "Yoshi, see if you can open the door from the outside. Maybe you can reach the lock. I'll go forwards."
"I'll go to the water side,"
said Akira. "Akira, did you pack anything more lethal than a crowbar?"
"Sorry, no."
He took a crowbar out of one of his pockets.
"Good idea, Jim.
He swung it a little.
Could be a useful weapon."
Akira walked gingerly to the water edge. There was something stirring in there. He turned on his torch and shone it into the water. "Ah!" he cried out. He turned and fled towards Jim, dropping the crowbar with a clang. Jim was looking past him. "Stop," he said. "Nothing's coming." Akira was puffing.
"I saw a crocodile," he said, "lying in the water. Those teeth, that—"
He stopped. "What?" said Jim.
"I'm sorry," said Akira. "Let me go back."
He turned and walked slowly. "What?" called Jim after Akira. Akira raised his short arm in dismissal. He stopped and picked up the crowbar from the shadowy floor. Jim walked after him. Akira stood at the water's edge.
50 centimeters deep, I am guessing," he said. "Maybe deeper, further in. See there," he said, pointing.
Jim followed with his eyes, and his heart jumped into his mouth.
"What the—" "Skull. It's a skull. A crocodile skull."
Jim wanted to jump to one side. He focused on the submerged object. It had a certain whiteness to it, but all the algae covering the bone contributed to the vitality of the terrifying visage that flickered below the water. It was only the eyeless sockets of the skull that confirmed the crocodile was a skeleton, not a living creature about to lunge at them from below. The water rippled. Jim stepped back. "What is that?" Yoshi trotted down to them, offering the key to Akira. "Can't reach the lock," he said in Japanese, then in disjointed English.
"You keep hold of it for now,"
said Akira, waving the crowbar up and down in his hand. "Oh, lamprey," said Yoshi, watching the water. "This water must connect to an underground river." Jim shone his torch into the water. "Eels!" His face wrinkled in disgust. "Nasty."
"Not unagi,"
said Akira.
"Lamprey."
"Blood-drinking fish," said Yoshi. "Leeches," said Jim.
"Leeches small things. Lampreys big fish. Big like unagi. But no mouth. Just big sucker."
"Never heard of that," said Jim.
"You like Romans, Jim," said Akira. "Romans fed their slaves to lamprey. Great Emperor Augustus forbade it."
They all stared at the rippling water. "I'll go first," said Jim. "These jeans are pretty thick. I'd like to see any suckerfish get through them." He bent down and started to stuff his jean ends into his socks. "As long as there aren't any live crocs in here, I'll be fine. You can follow on."
"We should go at the same time. Improve our odds,"
said Akira. "Let's see how deep this water is, and if these things bite." Jim looked over the 20 feet or so of water. He took his coat off and bundled it up over his head. "Let's hope this isn't a swim." Jim walked down the slope, carefully stepping into the water. "Who knows what's in here?" he said, turning sideways. "There could easily be big holes to fall into." The soles of his boots had little grip on the slippery bottom, and his footing felt tenuous and liable to suddenly shift. The water was up to his knees. and as he looked down he could see little below the surface through the flickering shadows that played on the surface of the water. "It's bloody cold," he said with fake cheer, feeling something brushing his leg. He stepped sideways another pace, feeling gently for a bottom that might not be there at all. "You're halfway," called Akira. Jim looked both ways. "Possibly," he called back. The cold water was soaking up his jeans, bringing a creeping dankness to him that seemed to seep inside his skin. There was a stale, musty odor rising from the water as he stirred up the sediment that had built up over centuries. "It's not getting any deeper," he said, feeling the squelch of mud underfoot. Something bumped the side of his calf. He grimaced as his heart skipped a beat. He wanted to kick out, but instead he moved sideways, trying not to do it too fast and lose his footing. "There is something in here, but it's not—" He stopped himself mid-sentence. He was sure whatever it was in the water would bite him the moment he said it wasn't going to. He had about 10 feet to go, maybe less. But things were moving between his legs now, like the tentacles of some giant octopus. "Hell," he muttered, shuffling faster. He felt a knock on his right shin, then another. There was a hard bump, and a press on the back of his right calf. He turned. Enough of worrying about a pitfall. He lifted his legs up and high-stepped through the water. "Are you okay?" called Yoshi. Jim threw his coat like a basketball onto the stone shore and started to run the final few feet, making large splashes as he struggled the last steps. He fell forward, rolling on the ground. There were lampreys hanging from his jeans, writhing now that they were out of the water. Jim groaned in disgust and grabbed one, tearing it off and throwing it away. The jawless creature had a sucker-like mouths with small, gripping, puncturing teeth that had half latched onto the denim. He stood up and pulled them off one by one. He looked at them squirming on the stone floor. He wanted to stamp on them and crush them out of existence. How could such disgusting creatures even exist in such a beautiful world? He watched them in their agony corkscrewing on the ground with whatever pain a fish can feel. He sighed and then one by one kicked them back into the water. He shuddered. I don't have to be evil too, he thought. He looked up. Yoshi was halfway across the pond, slowly walking on the water. Jim's mouth fell open. Akira stepped out behind him. He too was walking on the water. "The path of the righteous," called Akira. "I hope the stepping stones go the whole distance," called Yoshi, shining his torch into the murky water. "My legs are bare and tasty." Jim sat down and took his boots and socks off, then took off his pants and wrung them out as best he could as he watched Yoshi and Akira slowly pick their way across the pond. "Imagine doing this with crocodiles," said Yoshi, jumping the last step over the water. He turned and shone his torch toward the next submerged stone in front of Akira. "Thank you," said Akira, seemingly calculating every angle 10 times before making a move. Jim put his jeans, socks, and boots back on. They were damp, but that was better than wet. Akira sat on the last stepping stone, and Jim leant out and offered his hand. Akira grabbed him by the wrist and calculated his path one last time, then jumped forward to them. "Lampreys can't hurt you," said the professor. Jim looked down at the ragged scuff marks on his jeans. "Or so they say," added Akira. "These fish were very hungry," said Jim. Yoshi looked at Jim's jeans, then pulled up his robes a little, which were wet on the hem, and showed his bare legs. He smiled, but said nothing. "Okay, let's go before we find out there are still crocs in here," said Jim, shivering at the thought of the lampreys burrowing into his flesh to drink his blood. Chapter 24. The assistant abbot had seen the door before and wondered where it had led. He had only once been illuminated through meditation, and that one time had given him the revelation that the temple was a huge building, and that the inside he knew of was merely big. He had paced around the building, and he had paced within it, and he had realized the internal rooms of the rear quarter were unknown to him, and a mystery to all. He knew about the door. Everyone knew about the door that was never opened. He knew there were 7 enlightenments, but not what they were. He knew of the doors that no one could enter, but he had not tried to go through them. Now, he was stood at the door to the ultimate enlightenment, the 7th. What was more, he was about to enter with the chief abbot. He would have asked how to open the door, but years of training had taught him that silence was the answer to most problems. The chief abbot took 2 long keys from within his gowns. They were long green bronze barrels with spikes on the end. He pushed one into a hole in the left side of the stone doorway, and the other into another crevice on the right. He pushed the 2 together, and there was a clunk. "You may wonder why I am showing you this," said the chief abbot, smiling. The assistant abbot did not reply. "I do not know what will happen today, and perhaps I will ascend." The chief abbot smiled again. "I do not know what will happen next. I wish to pass on my knowledge to you, and then perhaps I will take the path of Sokushinbutsu." The assistant abbot gasped. No one in living memory had taken the path of self-mummification. To starve oneself to the edge of death, drinking poison to kill any parasites that might rot the body, then to entomb oneself in a coffin, ringing a bell to tell your fellow monks you still lived, seemed like a most terrifyingly sad way to die. To believe such self-embalming suicide allowed for timeless meditation was such a wicked lie that it was a practice long since banned in Japan. The chief abbot turned and began to walk up the steps ahead. He followed. Was he about to become the chief abbot? Chapter 25. "Is this the 7th enlightenment?" said Jim. "Or the 6th or the 5th? "I think this is the 7th, said Akira from behind. "This passage is the same as the first," said Yoshi. "It is exactly the same as the first passage to the key." "You think so?" said Jim. "You are correct," said Akira. "Well, here is the key," said Jim, looking at the new key of enlightenment, a replica of the first, but without the polish of hundreds of hands. "And the way ahead is blocked. This is some kind of wooden door." "So when I turn the handle, does the floor collapse?" "There are holes in the floor," said Akira. "And the roof looks like it could lower. Wait." Akira took out the crowbar and jammed it in the margin between the roof and the wall. "That may help." "Stand back," said Jim. "I can turn it and not be over the holes. When the door opens, we better get out of here fast." Jim moved alongside the key and to the right of it. He leant across and took it in both hands, then turned it. It moved a little, and Jim was grunting with the effort of turning the bronze door handle like key. There was a sudden loss of resistance, and the sound of a hammer blow. In an instant, 2 spikes shot up through the floor from the holes, directly where he would have been standing, then disappeared back into their sockets. Behind the wall, his effort had lifted some weight that had fallen like a fairground hammer on a device that shot the spikes up. He had wound a clock that was meant to kill him. "You bastards are going to have to do better than that," he grumbled. He stepped over the holes and put some weight on the flagstone. It didn't move. He pushed the door, but it didn't give. He checked again for keyholes. There were none. "One more half turn, I guess." "Turn it the other way," said Yoshi. "Why?" "That would be a reset." Jim thought for a second. "Not necessarily." "What could go wrong?" said Yoshi. Jim examined the walls he was standing by and the floor underneath him. "Okay," he said. He twisted the key, crouching in the same position as before. "Something wants to move," he grunted, "but not without a fight." There was an ugly cracking noise, and the door splintered and flew into the room beyond. The roof was falling fast. Jim grabbed the crowbar that was jammed into the roof. "Go!" he shouted. Yoshi shot forwards and out through the diminishing doorway. "Go!" Jim bellowed at Akira, whose one-handed effort was hardly material. "Go!" he screamed in the professor's face. Akira blinked, then staggered past him, scrambling the few feet to the doorway. The crowbar popped out of the jam, and as it did, so Jim lunged to the right. It was only a foot to the door. He jammed the crowbar between the roof and the floor, and with a crunch, the roof settled on it. Jim tried to crawl out, but he was held fast. His coat was caught under the end of the crowbar, and he was trapped. He started to struggle. "Give me a hand, will you?" He tried to look around, but only caught a glimpse at the space ahead. A kind of balcony, with Akira and Yoshi staring out at something. "Hey, I need help here!" Then they were there, trying to help him escape his coat. Akira had a knife. It must have been razor sharp, as it cut away pieces of the fabric and set him free. They pulled him out, making his progress to safety slower than if he had crawled without their help. He cleared the passageway and jumped to his feet. Jim started to laugh. "We're getting good at this," he said. He looked up and over the balcony. "Holy cow," he muttered. In front of them was a great hall, with high windows that the sun poured in through. Below was an altar, and on it a golden Buddha sat cross-legged in meditation. "The Buddha," said Akira, "in meditation for 2,400 years. Jim looked across the temple, and on another balcony stood the assistant abbot and the chief abbot. "We've got company," said Jim. "We know," said Akira. "Well, okay then," said Jim. "Let's go wake the old man up." Jim looked around them. Were there traps to kill them in sight of the Buddha? He trotted down the stairs, Akira and Yoshi following. "What an amazing room!" he called out, looking at the gilded wood architecture. The light poured into the room from above, illuminating the space in a glow that bathed the golden Buddha. Perched on his towering altar high up above them, the Pacific Buddha sat. "This is the Hibutsu," said Akira with awe in his voice. "I believe it is the sarcophagus of the living Buddha." "Not Buddha," said Yoshi. "Not living." "Young man," said Akira, "have you read the documents? Have you seen the artifacts? Have you traveled the world in a quest for the living Buddha?" "No," said Yoshi. "I have." "Then your hope has overcome your sense. Even the gods cannot live immortally in the flesh, or else they would be amongst us." "Guys," interrupted Jim, "I don't know what you're saying, but let's cut out the jabbering. This is a lethal configuration space." Akira stepped forward and started to ascend the stairs to the hidden Buddha statue. "What's the significance of these bundles of wood?" asked Jim as they stepped up. "And this straw?" Akira was transfixed by the statue and didn't reply. "Yoshi?" "I do not know." "The statue looks very worn," said Jim to no reply. If Jim had sat and studied the roof of the secret shrine, he would probably not have noticed 4 fine gold chains, or the white lead discs they were attached to on the high windows. No one saw the chains move, or saw the lead discs get pulled from their housings, or noticed the beams of focused sunlight streaming onto the head of the Buddha. What everyone did hear was a crunch, a cracking noise, and the shaking juddering of the monk's balcony as it started to slowly descend down the wall. The abbots gripped the balcony rail as it slid in jolting lurches downward. "Well, that's unexpected," said Jim. "Our friends just got a taste of their own medicine." Akira sniffed. "Burning," he said. Jim looked around. "Burning?" He sniffed. There was the smell of charring wood. It was close. He swung around. He sniffed again and sniffed some more. "We're in a bloody room full of tinder," he said, "and something is burning." "The Buddha!" yelped Yoshi. Jim looked at the worn wood statue. "It's smoldering." There were 4 points of focused sunlight on the head of the Buddha, and it was burning it, wisps of gray smoke spiraling upwards. Jim blocked one of the beams with his arms, and then the other 3. "This whole place is going up in smoke if I lower my arms." He laughed. "But I can't stand here forever. Akira, we're going to have to move Buddha, or he is going to be barbecued along with us." "But he will fall and be destroyed." "A little fall down the stairs shouldn't hurt," said Jim. Look Let's try and move the statue so the focus isn't going to catch it on fire. They surrounded the statue. It's not too heavy, said Yoshi. Push to the right. They pushed the statue an inch to the right, but the front beam was still singeing the wood. They pulled it backwards and forwards, but at least one beam was burning at the statue. If we push it off, it will fall, said Akira desperately. Jim looked down to the floor below. The abbots were stood there looking up, like tourists staring at a cathedral gargoyle. Okay, said Jim. Let's lift it up and see if we can carry it down. They huddled around it. Lift, said Jim. They heaved it up. Jim's hands went in a hollow space under the statue, and as they moved it towards the steps, Yoshi gave out a cry. He was rising up into the air. The platform the statue had been set on and that Yoshi was now standing on was rising as the weight of the statue was lifted from it. The statue was tilting forward in their grasp, and as Yoshi took off, he was pushing them to the edge. Jim could either let go or be cast down the steep stairs. He let go. Above them, Yoshi flew into the air, carried up by the platform. Below, the Hibitsu careened down the steep stairs. The abbot shrieked and ran, and the statue landed on its base and split into shards. A figure sat naked, alone in the wreckage. Jim turned around to see if Yoshi was all right, only to see a hole where the Buddha had sat. The platform on which Yoshi stood was 15 to 20 feet in the air and rising. It thumped to a stop, and Yoshi staggered. Another platform had risen to take the old one's place, and that was 30 feet in the air, supported by 4 wooden poles. Jim grabbed a pole and pulled on it, and it sank down as he put his full weight on it. Some counterbalance was at work. He looked into the hole as the second platform sank down, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. Akira was climbing awkwardly down the stairs. Yoshi jumped down the last couple of feet, and with his weight off the platform, the counterweight pulled the structure up, so that Jim had to let go as the second platform rose. Jim shook his head. We need to get out of here. Yoshi ran down the steps, and Jim followed. They were all prostrate in front of the naked figure, which sat in a lotus position. Is this the mummy of the Buddha? Said Jim, clomping down the stairs. Akira sat up, now in a cross-legged position. You don't believe, he said. I don't believe he is alive, if that's what you mean. He's not meditating, he's dead. I can see his skull where his dried skin has split. A bright beam of sunlight flashed through the skylights and lit the mummy. It looked sad and pained, resigned to suffering, locked into the twisted, bitter posture of an earthly life. Yoshi touched the right knee of the mummy. I get it, said Yoshi, sitting up. I get it. He stood and walked over to Jim. He bowed a little to Jim. Thanks for helping me through this. I need to break out of my old life. He strode over to the assistant abbot and tapped him on the shoulder as he lay prostrate to the mummy. The assistant abbot looked up. Yoshi smiled down at him. He offered his hand to the monk and helped him to his feet. Thanks, he said, for everything. When we get out of here, we should have a smoke. He turned to the chief abbot. He tapped him on the shoulder, and then tapped again. Begone, said the chief abbot. I'm venerating the Buddha. Come on, said Yoshi. He doesn't know or care. Take my hand. There was a pause, and the chief abbot rose. Thank you, Master Abbot, for everything you've done. Let's go now, into the world where the birds sing and the sky is blue. Yoshi turned to Akira and pulled him to his feet. Let's go. Let's go back into the world. Would you make a mummy of yourself? Akira felt a warmth fill him and smiled. How do we get out of here? Up there, through the gap the Buddha left, said Yoshi. He turned and went over to the chief abbot and took his hand. He lifted it up, and the abbot opened his fist, which held his lighter. The Buddha wouldn't thank you for killing yourself and burning him to ash. Come on, let's leave this place. He turned and ran up the stairs. Come on then. Yoshi stepped down onto the secondary platform. "Climb on with me, Akira-san." Akira stood next to him, and the platform sank. A minute passed, and the platform was rising again. "Jim-san," said Yoshi, "your turn." Jim got on the platform and it sank. "Yo, down here," called Jim as he descended. "Hi," Akira called back. Jim got off and the platform rose. He shone his torch around. Seeing as he did, Akira's light focused on something. "What have you got?" "A treasure." Jim strode over. He could see a glint, the unmistakable flash of gold. "The gold of Minamoto no Yoritomo." Jim shone his torch around the circular space. "It's lined up around the walls. There must be tons of it." He tried to pick up a brick, but failed to get a good enough grip. "That feels like $500,000 a bar," he said. Jim turned. The chief abbot was walking towards him. "Do you speak English?" he said. "No, sorry," said the chief abbot. "You have an ancient treasure," Akira said to the abbot. "We have no need of treasure, only of gods." "You have discovered a god also." Yoshi and the assistant abbot stepped off the lift. They were laughing. The chief abbot looked around at them and sighed. Jim turned as the light from above went out. "Let's hope this isn't a dungeon, because we just lost our way out." His heart sank a little into his stomach. Jim and Akira shone their torches around the circular room. "Passage!" exclaimed Akira. Jim ran towards the shadow in the wall. "It's a passage. Let's go." He stopped. Wait. Let's look for traps." Yoshi passed him. "There's nothing to fear. This will lead us out, I'm sure of it." He walked into the mouth of the passage. "It is okay, but I would find my path better with some illumination." Jim followed in behind him, his torch lighting up only the parts of the tunnel not blocked by Yoshi. "Take this," he offered. Yoshi took the torch and walked forward. "The tunnel comes to an end here," he said after a few yards. Jim examined the tunnel end. It looked as if it was under a staircase. He could see light coming in from outside. "Let me get in there," he said, examining the stones above. "There are locking bolts here," he said. "Stand back a bit. I'm going to move them and see what gives." The old bronze bolts moved as if they had just been set. Perhaps, thought Jim, it was the vibrations from above that kept them loose. He pushed up on the stone and it lifted. It was an 80-pound bench press, but he was going to lift it out. With a clunk, it fell out of its place and clunked down the steps. The gap was big enough to climb through, he thought, and he sat into the gap and lifted himself out. He was looking out of the main stairs of the temple. The whole temple was cordoned off, but people were still milling around the court beyond. They stopped and stared as he climbed out. Yoshi appeared, and the visitors began to take photographs and videos on their mobiles. Akira scrambled out next, and Yoshi and Jim lifted him free, and then the assistant abbot followed. Then finally, the chief abbot appeared. Monks began to swarm up the steps, and at the chief abbot's bidding, replaced the capstone of the tunnel, as if it was an everyday occurrence. Yoshi had stepped over the temple cordon and was walking away down the hill. Akira ran after him. "Where are you going?" "That is a fine question," replied Yoshi. "I'll be around." Akira watched him striding down the hill. Jim stepped over to Akira. "So much for your sleeping Buddha story. It was a treasure all along." Professor Akira Nakabashi turned to his friend Jim Evans and smiled. He knew what he meant by that gesture, and Jim thought he did too. Except, Jim was wrong.